and welcome to Cherry Pie Math. Today we're going to be converting to decimals from fractions. So to review a couple videos ago, and I'll link that in the description below, we talked about how to go from division to fractions and vice versa. But I also mentioned that we're going to be going back and forth with decimals as well. So just to review though, we're going to go from division to fractions and mix if necessary. So this first one, I have 30 divided by 4. As a fraction, it would be 30 over 4. But I can simplify it. Both of them are divisible by 2. So that becomes 15 over 2. So that would be my fraction. Because the numerator is larger than the denominator, I am going to change it to a mixed fraction. 2 can go into 15 7 times. You can see 2 times 7 is 14. Which means that we'll have 1 left over to make it to 15. So my mixed fraction is 7 1/2. And again, I'll link that video so that you can see like how we go from a fraction to an improper fraction to a mixed fraction and vice versa. So again, if I do that down here, 21 divided by 9 would look like this, but I can divide both of these by 3. And so this becomes 7 over 3 is my simplified fraction. And again, I can make a mixed fraction out of this because the top is bigger than the bottom. 3 goes into 7 twice with a remainder of 1, and then I keep that same denominator there. And that's just a quick review of going from division to fractions. So remember, a fraction is a part of the whole. And it shows us like how much of the whole we're talking about, whether that's I guess smaller or if it's multiple wholes like in a mixed fraction. A decimal is really similar to a fraction in that it shows you a part of the whole, but it's really more specifically a I guess not really it's the portion between 0 and 1. And on the number line. So you can have wholes, like when I say wholes, I mean like WHOLE, whole. But in a decimal, if I have like 3.02, the decimal is really this part here, the 0.02. This is the part that's showing the extra. That's not quite to the next number. It's not quite to 4. But it's showing how far away from 3 we're talking about. So each of them have a purpose. Sometimes we want to use the fraction form and sometimes we want to use the decimal form. Like, let's say we're looking at a number line, for example, and so here's 0, here's 1, that's supposed to be a 1. I got ahead of myself. That's a 2. Let's say I want to create, like I want to write 13 over 8. Then I would have to divide each of these into 8 parts, like this. So here, each of these are in 8 parts now. So 13 over 8 is 13, so that's 8 parts, and then I need 5 more, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This would be where it is. That's a lot harder than if I just said, oh, it's 1.625, so that's 1 and a little bit more than half. For example, so it would end up being exactly the same spot. So it's useful to use fractions. In my experience, it's more useful to use fractions when you're doing calculations by hand. Just because decimals can get unpredictable, but fractions are really easy to kind of keep track of what goes on the top, what goes on the bottom, whereas decimals are more useful when you're measuring. So like if you're baking, you're actually doing most of those calculations by hand because you're saying, oh, I'm going to be using 1.5 cups. So it's easier to kind of think of it as just you use the half cup 3 times. Whereas decimal is more useful in like a ruler, for example, like you want something to be 3.7 feet long, then it's a lot easier to use that decimal than it would be if I told you to use 21-ish over 7 as a fraction. So let's go over what just a quick review of what the bar in a fraction really means. It means division. So if I have like 3 over 5, this means 3 divided by 5, right? So to find decimal equivalents, we are really just going to be finding, doing the top, let me write that again. We're going to divide the top by the bottom. Or in other words, divide the numerator by the denominator. And that's really it. We're keeping the same definition of division. We're just actually calculating it using a calculator or using long division. For purposes of this video, we're just going to be using a calculator. So the steps of going from a fraction to a decimal is to first identify the numerator and denominator. So in this case, this is the numerator and this is the denominator. And then you would divide it. And then you would write the decimal. So you would do 3 divided by 5. And when you put this into a calculator, you end up with 0.6. There are some different versions of decimals that you're going to come across, and I'm going to address that here. So, for example, 1 divided by 4, if you put that in a calculator, you get 0.25. If you put 2 divided by 3, you get 0.6666666, etc. And if you put pi into the calculator, you have 3.141592653, etc. So you have a couple of different scenarios. In this one, it was just 0.25. And there was nothing else, and then it stopped. So I would write this as 0.25 because it's a really nice, easy decimal. There wasn't anything extra. I could just write 0.25. This next one is repeating. So if you have a repeating decimal, there's 2 ways I've seen this written. The first one is to kind of go 0.67. They just rounded, usually 2 decimal places is what is acceptable. So you would round the second number, in this case, up, because 6 is more than 5. I've also seen it as 0.6 with a bar on top. The bar means it's repeating. So if, for example, you had like 0.3737, blah, 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 you would write it as 0.37 with the bar on top of both. The bar on top means that you're repeating everything that's underneath that bar. Or another example would be like 0.1333. You would write it as 0.13 with the bar only on top of the 3 because that's the only thing repeating. This last one is there's no repetition and there's no end for both of them. So this is actually called an irrational number. You can't represent it as a fraction. And so this one is kind of special because it's pi. So obviously you could just write it as pi. But otherwise you would just write it as like 3.14 and then like decimal or point. Or kind of the same thing. Let's pretend you had like 0.39427, for example. Actually, that's a bad example. Let's change this to a 5. Then you would say, okay, you would keep the first 2, which would be 3 and then 9. But then we have a 5, which would make this bigger, which would make this bigger. So you'd actually round it to 0.4. But then you would put this in front of it. So that wavy thing means that it means it's not exactly equal to, it's an approximation, it's been rounded. So those are the 3 different kinds of decimals you'll come across. You'll have a nice decimal, you'll have a repeating decimal, or you'll have around this number decimal. Percentages are really similar. The only difference with this is first you take the decimal and then you multiply it by 100 and that equals your percentage. So for example, if I had a 0.35 as my decimal, I would multiply it by 100 and my percentage would be 35%. Really all you have to do is you just take this decimal 2 places that way and then you're done. So I'm going to quickly go through these. So 4 divided by 5, the fraction would be 4/5. I don't have to simplify it. I don't have to use a mixed number because the top is smaller in this case. If I put it into a calculator, I end up with 0.8. And that means my percentage is 80% because you would move the decimal point 2 places. And if there's an empty spot, you just put a 0. So the percentage would be 80%. 10 divided by 4 would look like this, but you can change it by dividing it by 2. So this equals 5/2. This is a mixed fraction. This is 2 1/2 because the top is bigger than the bottom. If you were to put this in a decimal, I would recommend using this to put it into your calculator. So just doing 5 divided by 2 into your calculator. But you'll end up with 2.5. And the other way to think about it is you would just put this number here, and then this fraction, 1 divided by 2, ends up being your decimal. Either way is fine. And this one, your percentage is 250%. Again, because you just move the decimal point 2 that way, and you keep everything in front of it. This next one, I gave you a mixed fraction. So remember, let's just go to the left first. If you think back to our other video, you multiply the bottom by the big number. So 7 times 3 is 21. And then you add the number on top, becomes 22. And so that becomes 22/7. Or I can write that over here. The decimal, I'm actually going to use a calculator for this. 1 second. This one's going to be a monster. This is the closest approximation to pi. So it's 3.14, and then it gets messy after that. It doesn't match quite the same, but it's the closest that we get. So we end up with this, and this whole thing gets repeated over and over. For the percentage, because it never ends, we're just going to take those first 2 and call it good. All right, the last one, I have 40%. And think back to here where I had 80% and then a 0.8. So it follows that 40% would just be 0.4. When you have a decimal, the easiest thing is to remember like your tenths, your hundredths, your thousandths place. This is in the tenths place, so to make it a fraction, I would do 4 divided by 10. So I'm going to write that over here, 4/10, which I can simplify to 2/5. That means it doesn't need a mixed fraction, and there's my division. So pause the video, go over those as you need to make sense of how I'm going from division to percentages and backwards. Just so you know, going from decimals to fractions is kind of annoying, so we're not really going to do a ton of it this year, or really ever. There's even a button on your calculator that you can use to just transfer it over, but it's helpful to practice a little bit, especially with the easier ones. So some things to remember: fraction is just division, which means we can make it into decimals and just go back and forth between those. Decimals really just represent the leftover part, and then any wholes will be in front. So kind of like here, this was the wholes and this was the decimal. Always simplify the fractions if you can. I know I've said that before, and I'll say it a million times more because students never remember to simplify fractions. It drives me crazy. And then percentages are just decimals. Just you move the decimal 2 places because you multiply it by 100. Okay, I hope that helps, and good luck.